Our speaker today is Dominic. I think most of you here know him, especially if you're a resident of St. Albans. He has served as the city manager for the past 15 years, and during this time, the city has developed the St. Albans model of public/private partnerships, using a thing called TIP, or tax incremental financing, and other development tools. Dominic's originally from Cincinnati, Ohio, holds degrees in government and public administration from St. John's University and Syracuse. Would you give please an OLLI welcome to Dominic Cloud. Thank you, John.
It's not usual that the speaker begins with saying we have an issue to discuss. I see this is a serious crowd. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. The St. Albans redevelopment story is a great story, and we tell it a lot around the state. And so it's really nice to be able to tell it here at home. Like many things in life, I find that, and this crowd can probably relate to this sentiment, just when you figure out what you're really doing, it's almost over. And we are coming to the end of our tax increment finance timeline. We have one more vote for consideration this March, and we'll talk a little bit about that this afternoon. But in hindsight, what we've learned is there is a method. There are some principles, and you only figure out that after you've been at it for a while, and you can say, there's some tactics here, some principles that are transferable to other communities. And St. Albans has really put the tax increment finance program on the map, and really a new approach to local government on the map. And I call it creating communities of distinction. It used to be that the rules for town and city managers were keep the tax rate down, keep the roads plowed, and make sure the first responders get there at a reasonable time, and let the market take care of itself. And you could spend 20 years doing that, riding it out. That works at some communities. Some communities have some natural gifts that allow the market to respond and do what's envisioned in your town plans without you having to lean into it. But that's not most of Vermont. I analogize it to going to the gym. There's some beautiful people out there who don't need to go to the gym. Most of us need to go to the gym. So that's what this presentation is about. I've boiled it down into 10 strategies and 10 practices for how you create a community of distinction, how you lean into it when the private market won't respond. As I was a couple months ago, can you see these? How hard is that to see? Can you make it out? All right. I won't assume you can see everything. So a couple months ago, I had a getaway weekend down in southern Vermont at this little cabin, which had a great weekend. And on Sunday morning, we left to grab some breakfast on the way out of town, and we stopped at the nearest town. This is a town with a strong economic base, some institutional activity, reason to think that it would be open for business on a Sunday morning at around 11. The only business we needed was breakfast, right? But as we crossed into town, the woman I was with said, "Boy, here's a town that's barely hanging on." Barely hanging on. And I thought that put it pretty well. And it was tempting to extol the virtues of public-private partnerships and tax increment financing. But I wanted to see her again. So I saved that conversation. And fortunately, Monday morning, John called and said, could you come talk to us? So I did have an outlet. But I knew what a community that's barely hanging on looks like. It looked like St. Albans about 10 years ago. And we were barely hanging on, you know, and people that stopped here, maybe they could have got some breakfast, but they didn't want to spend a whole lot of more time hanging around and experiencing St. Albans. Most of them were passing through. And on a municipal level, we were on an unsustainable path. The tax base, you can't deliver governmental services when your tax base is flat, and I'll return to that at the end. But our tax base hadn't grown in 10 years. You know, there was nothing new coming in. So everybody that was here had to keep putting in more or cutting services. And that's a race to the bottom, right? What other part of the body are we gonna cut off this year? Or how much more are we gonna ask people to kick in, right? And we saw double-digit tax increases, tax increases up in the high single digits. During the last 10 years, inflation until recently has been, right around 3%. And our average tax increase over that whole period is about 2%. So investors talk about returns and they try to beat the market, and public managers have to be sure that you're below the cost of living. And we've been able to do that because we created new tax base and we created a sense of place in St. Albans. And so that's the first principle. Great places don't just happen, they're made. A lot of communities will take a more passive approach, and you know it when you see it, so to speak. But once you say to yourself, thank you. Good loss prevention there, John. Once you figure out that you need to do something, that the market isn't responding to on its own, you need to identify the market failure and champion the need to intervene. And those two go hand in hand. If there's no market failure, you got no business being involved in it. Then you can go back to just plowing the streets and delivering governmental services. But if the market won't respond to what your town plans envision, if the tax base is flat and everywhere around you see signs of divestment, not investment, then you have a market failure. But it depends on what it is. In St. Albans, nobody could make any money in real estate development. That was one of the problems. That was the market failure we identified. Real developers, therefore they weren't doing real estate development and creating tax base. Developers do commercial and residential development for two reasons. They get a better return in the stock market, and it's funner. But if you can't offer that better return measured with the risk, they're going to go do a project in another community, or they're going to keep their money in the stock market. And we learned that on this first project. This is the St. Albans house. And this thing sat empty and deteriorating for well over a decade. Maybe if it had a different name, we would have made, if it was the Essex House or the Milton House, we wouldn't have tried to restore it, but it really became a symbol of the city's rebirth. And I toured every developer in northwestern Vermont through this thing. They all loved the historic character, they all saw the potential, but none of them could get the numbers to work. And so there's that gap. There's the market failure. I want to do this project. I love the building. I have a vision, but the bank won't lend me the money because there's a gap in the pro forma. And here wasn't a huge gap. And so this property was on the grand list for $50,000. We found a developer who was interested in doing a redevelopment of the property using the historic tax credits, and there's two tax credits, a federal one and a state one, and they're present in almost all of the renovations that you see around the city. But the rents that he could charge weren't going to be strong enough to pay the loan that he was going to get from the bank. So he had a gap turned out to be of around $150,000. And so what the city did was we said, here's a grant of $50,000. You fix up the outside. And here's a loan of $100,000 just at our cost of borrowing. So we can borrow still at about 2 or 3%. Back then it was at about 2%. Here's $100,000, you fix it up, you pay us interest for 5 years, and at the end of 5 years, you pay us back. And that's exactly what happened. Well, today the building is fully leased. If you drive down Lake Street, that's what it looks like. We got all of our money back, not the 50, that was a grant, but we got the 100 all back. And it went from being worth, on the grand list, appraised at $50,000 to $1.2 million. And that right there, that simple twist, is how you grow the tax base. And I'll talk about some other principles that are embedded within that. But it also gives rise to the next principle, which is to play both offense and defense. Most of government, particularly local government, is defensive. We plan, we regulate, and we're mostly in the business of saying no. Most development projects happen despite, developers will say, despite the best efforts of the town to kill it, we got our project through. That's a defensive strategy, and that assumes that the market will respond and will build what the community envisions. So that's what it's like in South Burlington. That's what it's like in Williston. That's what it's like in the Upper Valley. There's about a dozen communities where that works. There's 250 cities and towns in Vermont. So, and those communities where that works have some share of the population, but it's about a third of the population. In most of Vermont, we need to play offense, not just defense. We still do all the governmental stuff. We still plan, we still regulate. We've got an interest there to protect the common good, but we also have an interest to make sure that we're a place where people stop when they're thinking about driving to St. Albans for breakfast, and they don't continue on to the next town. We also have an obligation to make sure that this is a place where people build housing, where families want to live, where employers locate. And those are offensive strategies. It can happen on a macro scale or a really large scale, which I'll show you in a bit. And it can also happen on a micro scale. So this is a new business that just opened up downtown called Little Little. Little Little is a children's clothing store. Encourage you to stop in if you haven't been in yet. But this prospective business owner came by City Hall 6 months or so ago and had done a lot of her homework and said, here's my business, here's my vision, here's my business plan, here's my bank approval, here's my access to capital. But I can't find any space in St. Albans that I want to open my business in. I said, well, why not? Well, everything that's there is either too expensive or hasn't been renovated in 30 years. And when I talk to the property owner about renovating it so that I can open up my new business, they say, yeah, I'd be happy to renovate it for you. It'll be probably about, 80 to 100,000, and you don't have to pay me, I'll just build it into the rent. Well, what's the rent gonna be? Well, then that gets layered in and it increases the rent by 40% or so. And then all of a sudden that pro forma is out the window and the bank won't finance it. And there's the market failure. And so that building sits empty. And when people drive down Main Street and they see an empty building, they don't say, boy, I wish that property owner would take better care of its property. Some do. But most people say, boy, this community is really hanging on. And they keep moving. And so it's a problem. That market failure is a problem not just for that building owner, not just for that business owner, but mostly for all of us. So the city had some ARPA funds from the federal government that were ARPA's the acronym for some of the aid that have come out to the towns that were specifically designed to help communities climb out of the pandemic. And so we entered a public-private partnership here that fixed up the outside of the building. Fixed up with the outside of the building benefits everybody, right? Not just that business, but the business next door, across the street. We also fixed up the inside of the building. Federal government's fond of these 80-20 matches, so we put in $80,000 of federal money and then asked the property owner and the new business owner to split the 20. So we put $100,000 into it, and they signed a 5-year lease. So there, we're not creating additional tax base, but we're creating additional economic activity, and we're also creating a sense of place. It's hard to fill 5 vacancies when if you've got 5 vacancies out of 10, that's hard to fill. But as you begin to fill vacancies in your downtown, it gets easier and easier. And we've had some successes in some of those new businesses that didn't quite reach their potential, in my opinion. But for us, the costs of doing nothing has to be included in the calculation. So the next principle is to use your powers of public finance to accomplish what the community envisions. And public finance can be a lot of things. When you think about public finance, and you think about economic development, communities have significant strengths that aren't always deployed unless you're following this model. The first is access to capital. We can borrow at half the cost of anybody else. And so we don't always have to have the cash on hand. We can borrow that money from the bank and guarantee it and pass it through at a rate that's lower than the cost of borrowing. The second is we can measure returns qualitatively and quantitatively. So we get our money back, and we always get it back with something that recognizes the time value of money. But we have to consider the cost of doing nothing as well. And we can ask for that money in a longer term than a typical private investor will. Private investors looking for a double-digit return, typically in 7 years, so they can get out and do another deal. If you're borrowing money from the bank right now, it's at 7%. Well, a public entity can say, the line out the door is as important to us as the bottom line. So we're going to lend to you at the cost of that our cost of money, which is 3%, We just want our money back in 5 years so we can turn around and do it for somebody else. And so communities that don't have tax increment finance districts, communities that have the federal ARPA dollars that have come down, communities that have a local option tax and want to redirect some of those funds, captured on the internet, if you will, and reinvest them in Main Street. They can all do programs like this without creating a tax increment finance district. But a TIF district is where the real money is. That's how you do large-scale transformation, the type of transformation that St. Albans needed. So that was St. Albans. That's probably 2014 or so. You see the big parking lot where now there's a parking garage, the space where the bulldozer is there at the bottom, that's the former Moose. This building right here, we bought that my first week on the job. That's where the new state office building is. Here it is 5 years later. We never raised anybody's taxes to do this. We used our access to capital in tax increment financing. The city's role in these deals was to have the vision for it, to take the risks on buying the land. We then clean the land, we get rid of all the environmental contaminants, and then we broker the deals that the community envisions in their policy documents. That's that offensive, proactive approach. Where you see the hotel on Lake Street in the bottom of the page here, my favorite planning document comes out of 1987, as I was just beginning high school. And it's a redevelopment plan for St. Albans. It says things like, attract a nationally branded hotel downtown, construct a multi-story parking garage so there's plenty of parking, complete beautifications on Main Street so that there's a compelling sense of place. Now we call that streetscaping, and so on and so forth. And so much of what we have operationalized through the tax increment finance district were not new ideas. They were literally sitting on the shelf since the mid-'80s. The difference from a resource perspective is tax increment financing. So here's how TIF works. The basic premise of TIF is you want to balance your public improvements with your private improvements. You can picture a scale like the scales of justice. You know, you got public on one side and private on the other. And your public improvements have to have what's called a nexus to the private improvements. You have to be able to demonstrate and show to the state of Vermont that there's a reasonable case that these public improvements will incent these private improvements. And so in our case, it was this parking garage that was going to serve the new office building, the new hotel. It was the streetscape along Lake Street and along Main Street and along Kingman that creates that compelling sense of place. And it was brownfield cleanup throughout the heart of the downtown. The ACE project was primarily a brownfield cleanup project. If I had it to do over again, I would put a lot more of our plan into brownfield cleanup. You know, the city's role in these projects is to take on the deal killers, if you will. And in dense communities and downtowns, there's two major deal killers, brownfields and parking. And so we can take on all of those, absorb those through the TIF program, and that allows the private projects to be completed. So you come up with this plan, and in our case, you know, most of what we did was implement the 1987 St. Albans redevelopment strategy. And you propose it to the state of Vermont, There's a board that oversees it called the Vermont Economic Progress Council. And since the late 90s, we've had a statewide property tax. And so that's the big reason that the state is involved, because on a typical tax bill, if you have a $5,000 tax bill, in St. Albans, in rough numbers, it's about $3,500 that's going to the school system and $1,500 that's going to the municipal side. Fluctuates depending year and year. And outside of a TIF, the only funding source for these projects is that $1,500, that municipal portion of your tax bill, right? And so that's why it's really hard to pull these things off, because you're only able to access about a third of the tax bill. But the education fund, of course, can't create tax base. And so under tax increment financing, the state of Vermont says, for a period of 20 years, you can have access to 75% of the tax revenues that would ordinarily accrue to the ed fund. Now, not everything that's here now, right? So it's not a slice out of what exists. This blue portion here is called the original taxable value, the base value of the TIF district. So you don't get to slice into any of this. But what you can use to service the bonds on your public improvement is the tax revenues that come in from the new development. So the parking garage, round numbers, cost about $10 million. All of this in the original years, our debt service was about $1 million a year. And under TIF, we can use the tax proceeds not just of the municipal share, not just of our $1,500 on a $5,000 tax bill, but also 75% of the education fund. So the hotel's tax bill is $250,000 or so, combined for the municipality, the city's share, and the state's share. And we take 100% of the city's share, and we take 75% of the education fund share, and we use that and put it towards our $1 million debt payment. Now, that's not the only parcel, of course, that pays in, because it's a district-wide approach. And so when the state office building sold to Mylan, it was on the tax rolls for nothing because it was tax exempt, and Mylan paid $8 million for it, and so then that was on the tax rolls for $8 million. Similar thing happened with the investment at the co-op. The new state office building is leased so that it's taxable. And you put that puzzle together, and that's how you get the ability to service a $1 million tax bill. The promise of TIF, of course, is that at the end of the life of the district, this base value goes from here to here. I want to come back to that at the end, because that's a bit of the problem we find ourselves in today with the challenges of the education fund, is we haven't grown the statewide grand list, the statewide tax base enough. But that's TIF in a nutshell. At its core, it's very simple. We draw a line, and the municipality gets permission from the state of Vermont to go out and complete public improvements that will incent new development, and the tax revenues from that new development pay off the bonds on the public improvements that were necessary to get them to come in. Now, there's a whole bunch of details related to that, and it can get very, very technical. But the base concept is relatively simple. I've never seen anything as powerful as tax increment financing. In the 10 years that preceded our TIF, our tax base was essentially flat and beginning to go backwards. And in the 10 years since, we added 70 million. 70 million. Now, in round numbers, 10 million's a Walmart, right? Remember the big fight we had about Walmart? We added 7 of them. Hotels, is 10 million. The state office building is 10 million. Those new buildings at Congress and Main are at 6 to 7. That's how we can broaden the tax base for the whole state, and also for us here in St. Albans. But one of the most unique things about TIF in Vermont is it's not I oftentimes describe my role as the chief persuasion officer. My job is to package up the ideas, propose them to the city council, and then ultimately propose them to the voters. And when you propose them to the voters, you get tremendous power when the whole community has a chance to come in and say, yeah, I think this is a good idea. I'm willing to allow my property to be pledged as the security for this project. So I called that crowdsourcing that vision through the ballot box. And so too often in communities, our elected leaders and appointed leaders like myself will put forward a proposal and stop there. And that might have worked before we had social media. But what that does is that just creates a huge vacuum. And those that oppose the project oftentimes can really drive the debate and occupy the field, so to speak. And so it's not just enough to crowdsource that vision through the ballot box. You need to campaign for it. And so this is an ad that's rolling presently in the Messenger and online. Has anybody seen it yet? Yeah, okay. And it basically restates what I've been describing this morning. These are 3 of our most successful projects. This is the old Moose. This is what it looked like before we had a Hampton Inn. This is the site where we now have Ace Hardware. That's today. And this is the site of Congress and Main, where we now have Northwestern Medical Center and the Community College of Vermont and 60 brand new units of housing. So we have one final TIF project coming up in March, and that's an $11.4 million bond issue, and I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end of it. But the heart of that project and that question is a $10 million proposal to do some additional market rate housing in the heart of the downtown. But we're only able to be in that game because the city has acquired the land to control its destiny. So after we had completed the big downtown core project with the state office building and the hotel and the streetscape project, I was going to, catch my breath a little bit and allow some things to settle. But the thing about a TIF is you only have 20 years to retain those increments from the education fund. And you only have 10 years in which you can issue debt. And so right across from my office was this property. This property was owned by a local developer who fell in some hard times and got into foreclosure with the bank. And Ultimately, we sat there and looked at it for a long time, and I mentioned I was feeling a little more conservative at the time, and the city council and the mayor at the time came to me and said, you need to put your big boy pants on and figure out a way to buy this property. We've come too far to allow somebody else to buy this property or to allow the buildings to fall into disrepair. And so we used our access to capital, and we walked down the street and were able to put a deal together with the bank to buy it on the verge of foreclosure. At that time, we didn't necessarily know what we were going to do with it. We just knew that it was too prominent to allow it to fall into disrepair. So it came with this building, this property, and these two. And we spent some time seeing if we could reuse what was there. Sure.
Where is this?
That is.
I can't see it well.
Oh, really?
That's okay, just tell us.
Yeah, okay, sure. So that's right downtown, right across from, that doesn't look like that anymore. Looks like that now. So we bought the parcels, and eventually we assembled a real estate deal that allowed us to attract the Community College of Vermont and Northwestern Medical Center to the heart of the downtown. And we'd been trying to recruit CCV downtown, for 20 years, right? There's a handful of uses that you move heaven and earth to get downtown, and colleges is one of them. So we were able to put together a deal with Congress in Maine that allowed us to, it turned out we needed a new police station at the same time that we were trying to get CCV to come downtown. And so we entered a public-private partnership again where the city leased we had one developer build this new building and then lease space to CCV, and then also lease space to the city for a police station in what was the old CCV. And putting the two of those together, we were able to drive down costs enough so that it was attractive enough for the developer and attractive enough for CCV. That was a $5 million nut. And there's other public safety proposals currently on the ballot in other communities that are a lot more than that, right? And so using the power of tax increment financing and also using the power of what I call administrative decisions that you were going to make anyway, we're able to drive down costs and not just get a brand new building downtown, but also get a new police station out of the deal. But none of that happens if we don't acquire the land to control its destiny and put together the deal. You can always sell the land. You can't always buy it. So what's the role of the city manager in this process then? A lot of it is selling good ideas. Good ideas are, I find they're fairly easy to sell, knock on wood. It's like people that sell certain brands of cars. The cars and their record and their reliability sell themselves. And if it's a good idea that tracks back to the community's vision and the community's plan, I've found that the voter support will be there. If you put together, you got to have the right idea, and then you got to have the right execution of that idea, and shows how you've thought of what are you going to do if it blows up, what are your contingency plans. But a part of the job is selling the ideas. One of those right now is a project that we're proposing at the former Fonda container. So anybody work at Fonda that's in the room back in the day? The former Fonda Solo factory at the top of Lower Newton.
'Cause I know it's been closed. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
this is a 5-acre parcel. At the time, it was 150,000 square feet, 600 jobs. And then when I arrived on the scene, it was a property that we owned for $300,000, and the cleanup costs, the environmental costs, were going to be north of $4 million to clean it up, right? So there's that market failure, right? It can sit there, and everybody that can drive by it and say, boy, I wish somebody would do it. Or the city can step in and use our ability to measure that return over a longer period of time and our access to capital to clean it up. So it's a 5-acre site. There's $5 million of public money that's been plowed into it. Only $1 million of that is city dollars using tax increment financing. The rest of it's federal funds. But it's $1 million an acre. So if you remember earlier, I was saying if I had it to do over again, I would file a plan that is more, a TIF plan that's more focused on brownfields. That's in large part where that sentiment comes from, is it's really expensive to clean up the properties that are located in our historic downtowns and where all of the places where our regulators say we want to build. So presently, in the far corner here is the completed commercial building. That's a 10,000 square foot building that's owned by Connor Contracting and leased to the American Rail Dispatch Center. It's appraised for a little over $1 million. Railroad, as you know, for a long time was tax exempt at the corner of Lake and Federal. This is now proposed to be a senior housing development with the Cathedral Square Corporation. That'll be, which is a nonprofit developer, still pays tax. And that will be, construction on that will start this summer. That's 30-odd senior housing units, mixed income. And then what's really exciting is the city's recruiting for developers to build an additional 90 units, probably in 3 buildings on the remainder of the site. There'll be a new city street that's part of it. There'll be a new pathway that, or rec path that will connect to the Missisquoi Valley Rail Trail up at this end. The intersection will be signalized with mast arms. It'll be a 4-way stop. New sidewalks connecting all of this. But one of the things that I'm most excited about with this project is the city was recently awarded some funds from the Vermont Housing Finance Agency to go create, to give us access to low-cost capital so that we can recruit developers to build market rate units. So this is targeted to be, let's call it, between 80 and 120% of area median income. So household income, that's what most folks are making. The market for affordable housing, deeply affordable, demand for that is off the charts, but we know how to do it. There is no market failure there. The state and federal tax programs work well. The market failure is for workforce housing in that 80 to 120 space. And so that's why the city is involved in this project at Fonda and also in the Bellevue project, which I'm going to tell you about in a sec. All of this can be pretty risky. In our view, risk is a part of leadership, though, and it should be managed, not avoided. If you don't buy the land, you can't control its destiny. And as a public entity, we have tools at our disposal that no other entity has, and the community as a whole ultimately gets to weigh in and say, yeah, we like this idea, or this is a terrible idea. Back out of it. So you can always back out of it. You can always sell it, but you can't always buy it. So we like to buy the land and assemble the public-private partnerships that reflect the vision that the community has. And at the top of that list right now is the Bellevue redevelopment project. This will be located right in back of City Hall between Center Street and Hudson Street. When we get to the final design, more final design, we'll figure out exactly how many buildings. Right now it's envisioned to be 2 buildings. One in the former Bellevue, the white building right on Main Street there. We'll keep that historic facade, and then in back of it, we'll build another building. There'll be some mixed-use component there. We'll figure out exactly what the balance is between the non-residential units and the residential units. But the second building is envisioned to be primarily, if not exclusively, residential. And this is that same workforce housing income block, 80 to 120, where we're seeing the greatest need, where we're hearing from our employers, I'd like to hire somebody to come work for me at any one of our major employers. I've had conversations with all of them, but my new employees can't find a place to live. And never waste a crisis. So this is the team that was assembled. I wish you could see that better. That was assembled to take on this challenge. And this is that downtown core parking lot where now we have the parking garage, and in back of it you can barely see a red building. That's where the state office building sits. At the time, this was the city's downtown board, the city council, and People's Trust, the local bank, which has been our financial partner throughout all of it. And as you all know, St. Albans is a different place. This is a place where people say, this is no longer a community that's barely hanging on. This is a place where I'd like to go to a festival, where I'd like to stop for lunch when I'm passing through, and where I think, one of our, I think, big advantages is we've got great houses in a walkable community. You can get a lot of house for the money in St. Albans. And so we hear time and time again people stopping for lunch and ending up calling a realtor on their way home. So that's our story. Can I answer any questions? John?
I had a comment in the Christmas time when the lights on Terry Park go on.
Yeah,
Oh man, that really makes us shine.
thank you. That's
And
tough.
the park, the fountain now,
Yeah,
courtesy of the Rotary Club and the rest of the community.
yeah. I'm glad you mentioned the Rotary story, because there's a lot of, I could have shown a lot of slides. I could have talked about the pool, but what we found is there's a momentum that builds where the city no longer has to do it all. It was right on the heels of the first successful project that Rotary came forward and said, let's work together on the fountain.
And a pitch for Rotary, this is our 100th year, founded in 1924.
Wow.
This is 100 years.
Wow. Richard?
Dominic, I know you're not on State Auditor Doug Hoffer's Christmas card list,
Yeah.
but do you feel your dealings with state government have been pretty decent over the years?
Well, state government's not monolithic. 90% of state government has been an incredible partner. And the city of St. Albans could not do any of this without the state of Vermont. That's my overarching feel. From the original negotiation for the first project. So the way this came together, Mylan walked in one day and said, we'd really like to expand. We need to expand. We'd really like to expand here. Do you have any ideas for where we could get some additional land? And the state office building was right next door. And Shumlin was governor at the time, and we set up this vision and this idea. We went to Shumlin and got him on board. Ultimately, though, in order to sell the state office building, we literally needed an act of the legislature. And then we needed to, not just to sell their building, but to then relocate all of their employees into a downtown, brand new building, and to move from a ownership situation into a leased situation, because we needed it to be taxable. And the state of Vermont was a great partner. You know, the buildings commissioner was a fierce negotiator, but we all have a job to do, right? And so, from approving the TIF to then using their institutional leverage, they've been tremendous. You know, my comments about Mr. Hoffer are well on the record. You know, I think where you stand depends on where you sit, and that's reflected in the audits. But I will say, the conflict between municipalities being audited and the state auditor goes back before Doug was there. His predecessor had the same problem, same perspective. And one of the ways that the state came up to mitigate that was they developed a document called the Agreed Upon Procedures. Every single year, the city's TIF is audited by an independent auditing firm using the Agreed Upon Procedures. And there's never been a significant finding in our Agreed Upon Procedures based on the truly independent auditor, right? So, you know, I'll stop there, but for local taxpayers, it's important for folks to know that the city was never found by a regulatory body to have done anything wrong with our TIF. It's the Economic Progress Council that regulates us, not the state auditor. VEPSI has told us, refers to us as their poster child. And our annual audits by our independent auditors following the AUPs have always been without a blemish. And I think that's what speaks to the record. Up here, sir.
How much influence does the railroad have with you?
Depends on the subject matter. You know, we negotiate with the railroad a lot, right? At the end of the day, the railroad's a major employer with really good jobs, as they have been for 100 years. And, you know, we tussle with them over what was there first, the rail line or the road. But at the end of the day, they're a major employer that we want to keep. So, you know, that's the nature of the relationship. It's a major stakeholder, a major client.
Thank you.
Yeah. In the back.
Excuse me, are there any plans for the old railroad building that is no longer in use?
Yeah.
It's such a beautiful building, I
I
hate
know,
to see
I
anything
agree.
happen to it.
There's a lot of ideas. It's not well suited. Most folks feel that have looked at it, it's not a great fit for housing because of the layout. Converting commercial space to housing is a tough nut. And so then you're back to that market failure again, right? So, you know, we have a foot in that conversation, but we've got enough on our plate right now with other projects. You know, it's not currently on our list, but it'll happen. You know, someday it'll happen. It might be like some of the other properties that we've been talking about here that sat vacant for a while until we were able to repurpose them. It's not a great fit for TIF because of our timeline. You know, if the statute changes and we're able to have another TIF, maybe that's something that we would look at. But I think our best role there is that broker role, trying to assemble the partnership and bring somebody to it who could use it. All ideas welcome.
And what about the Highland Shopping Center? Is that what it's called? Highgate shopping.
Highgate, yeah.
It's more and more empty stores there, and is it just gonna go down?
Yeah, that's not in the city, so I'm less familiar with it.
Oh, that's in the town.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we'd have that solved if it was in the city. No, I hear whisperings of things that happening up there. I think, but I'm not close enough to anybody to speak with authority. Up here, yeah.
What about the place, I can't say the name of it, where the government, when people were getting their passports and things like that,
Yeah.
and all flooded out.
Yeah.
Is anything ever gonna happen to that building, or is that all federal and has nothing to do with the state?
Yeah, so that was one of our largest taxpayers, the Tabor Center. You know, that was a real hit. It's the gold standard for real estate development because it's a private building leased to the federal government. You don't get a better tenant than that, right? But it was a perfect storm of what happened to that building combined with the agency deciding that their employees and their business model can do just as well with more of a work at home model than a work in the office model. And so we were trying to put them at Fonda for a long time.
Yeah, there's all that land down there. Every time I go there, I feel sad.
Yeah.
It's not being used.
Yeah. So it's sold, and the Belly company that they're on Lower Newton now. They're a shipping company with boxes. I believe that they own it now, but I don't know too much about what their plans for it are. Yeah. A twofer for Richard.
Dominic, I'm sure you got plenty of things on your plate, I know, but do you give any attention or any hope that the Amtrak Vermonter might finally get to Montreal one of these years?
I have lots of hope, you know.
Realistic?
Yeah, you know, they are making progress. It's above my pay grade, you know, but it literally takes an act of Congress and you know, there's security issues. We meet with Amtrak a couple times a year and ask about it. They, you know, assure us that they are making progress on it. But it's a better, you know, the governor and the delegation are much closer to it than we are. So, but you know, all of those conversations are positive, right? None of them are this dog won't hunt. There's consensus that they want to make it happen. It's just hard to pull off. Thanks for your time. Yeah.
I think there's more work for Dominic ahead. For those of you who like to have a conversation with me about the issues that I was talking about, back in the corner, please. Thank you much. Oh, one thing important too. We'll have a meeting next week. So don't show up next week. What do you do if you're a lone ranger?
I think it's probably a small